This is a response video to a YouTuber known as Drallasta. I found her channel after watching the debate on Andy Worski that was her and David Charette versus the Alternative Hypothesis and Sean Last. In this video, she's critiquing a video that Alt-Hype did about why he believes the racial gaps in IQ in the United States are 80% genetic in origin. This video by Drallasta was extremely irritating to watch because while Alt-Hype made some sloppy mistakes, none of these errors were of any real consequence. The mistakes don't represent a misunderstanding of the science under debate. However, in the process of pointing out these errors, she continuously demonstrates her own lack of knowledge or understanding of these topics, and when not pointing out mistakes and actually challenging him on a claim, she concentrates on things that are well within the mainstream. You'd think going into this video that she'd concentrate on the racial IQ differences are 80% the consequence of genes claim. This is not a mainstream opinion, which is why Alt-Hype provides 3 arguments to justify it. Her only actual engagement with the 80% claim is offering an extremely disingenuous interpretation of what he meant by 80%, and then ends the video without even presenting what his second and third arguments were. All that being said, this response video should not be construed as a defense of Alt-Hype specifically or in general. And as a final preface before getting into the video, she frames this critique of Alt-Hype as a kind of defense of Robert Plomin from being slandered, which is something to keep in mind during this response. So, let's get into the video.
One thing a lot of people ask me is why I think the racial gaps in the US all told are around 80% a function of genetic differences.
Well, it seems like an ideological hang-up to me, to be honest.
Why specifically that number? Why not 50%? Why not 100%? Why not 10%?
Considering none of these are within the new paper in Nature, which says between 20 and 50%, I'd revise your estimate down. Wait. Robert Plomin is the lead author.
Okay, so there's several things wrong with this. First, it is well known that GWAS studies do not produce heritability estimates as high as quantitative genetics, nor should they. The limitations of these studies are well known, and nobody in the field expects GWAS studies to show an accurate heritability of intelligence, at least not today. In fact, these quantitative genetic estimates are used as a benchmark against which these GWAS studies are tested. Here's Plomin himself describing how, as of December 2016, GWAS can account for 5% of the variance in intelligence at the time and 10% of the variance in school performance.
So for behavioral traits that I study, like intelligence, 6 months ago we were able to explain 1% of the variance. We can now explain 5% of the variance. With educational achievement, though, we can explain 10% of the variance. So that means you take these tests, in England we have these tests called GCSE, which all children at the age of 16, at the end of compulsory schooling, have to take, national exams. We can explain 10% of the variance on that. Now we just got started, and we can explain 10% of the variance. It's about 60% heritable.
So the point is, the current state of GWAS studies should not be used as the best estimate of heritability of anything, at least not today. Also, you seem to be conflating general heritability and Alt-Hype's claim of between-group genetic difference accounting for between-group trait difference, which is a very distinct thing from heritability. It seems to me very odd that you'd be trying to argue on general heritability when it's perfectly possible to accept the heritability of IQ being in the 70 to 80% range, but the between-race IQ differences being entirely environmental. The classical example of this would be planting genetically similar seeds in different soil.
I cited previously that intelligence researchers believe that the black-white IQ gap in the US is around 50% heritable, but I'm over here at 80%.
Intelligence researchers believe. You realize asking what experts think doesn't mean anything. So I came off Scholar and searched just regularly into Google. That's no journal. That's a PowerPoint. This data wasn't published in any scientific journal that I can find. Also, polling intelligence researchers about genetics is even more pointless than polling geneticists about genetics.
He's only citing what experts believe in order to contrast with what he believes. He's basically demonstrating that his opinion is higher than the mean of what experts in intelligence think is supported by the evidence, but it's not entirely out of the mainstream. So yes, the survey wasn't submitted, or at least accepted, to a journal. I'm not sure what the point of peer review is on a survey, but lest you think that the results of the survey are somehow cooking the books on what experts really think here, there actually are peer-reviewed journal papers that look into this. One of them is from Snyderman and Rothman, 1987. This paper polled experts consisting of 661 respondents from various disciplines and found that 45% thought the black-white IQ gap to be partly genetic in origin, 24% thought there wasn't enough data to support any reasonable reasonable opinion, 15% thought the differences to be entirely environmental, 14% didn't respond to the specific question, and 1% thought the differences were entirely genetic. This doesn't give the same granularity as the 2013 survey, but it's in the same ballpark despite being done 25 years earlier.
So first we can look at the high heritability of IQ within the United States, which is about 75% in adulthood based on 2 different kinds of twin studies and family relations studies.
Okay, to point out how many things are wrong with this sentence is difficult. So again, he's decided to leave out the citation for this graph, so I had to go find it myself. What alt-hype doesn't realize is that if you only cite some of your data, it makes me question, why is he hiding this? Before I go to the actual citation, here's a few things I can say without the graphs from just here. The y-axis isn't heritability or percentage heritability, it's percentage of variance. Variance is something used in statistics to quantify how grouped a dataset is.
Okay, so this is really strange. This makes me think you don't have an understanding of behavioral genetics. You seem to be a fan of Plomin, who wrote a good textbook on it. You should probably read it. In behavioral genetics, they're trying to explain what proportion of the variance in some observable trait can be attributed to genetic variation. What they're presenting in this graph is what proportion of the observed variance in IQ can be explained by genetics, as well as what proportion of the variance can be explained by the shared environment. Since they're accounting for environment as well, it wouldn't make sense to have the y-axis labeled heritability.
And as you read the paper that alt-hype doesn't link, you realise that this paper is on the Wilson's effect, where the heritability of IQ increases with age. It means as you get older, your IQ is more likely to be similar to your parents.
I'm not sure what the point is in objecting to the paper being about the Wilson effect. There's really no better topic to point to when arguing the high heritability of IQ. Besides, this paper isn't just about the Wilson effect, this paper actually coined the term Wilson effect. The key takeaway here is that when you take all the twin studies that have ever been done and average them all out, you get a heritability of about 50%. However, the problem with this method is that many of those studies looked at heritability in children. It doesn't seem controversial to me that what we should really care about is the heritability of IQ in adults.
You see, when alt-hype points to 0.8 and says it's 80, he's actually pointing to the data point that's Dutch data.
This chart doesn't only reference Dutch data. Yes, the chart is centered on the Dutch data, which was used to create the solid polynomial best fit line, but the purpose is to compare it to other studies to show the large amount of corroborating evidence for the Wilson effect. Right below the Dutch line is data from Haworth 2010, which included data from 6 twin studies, 3 of which were from the United States. The dotted line labeled MZA twins, which is what alt-hype was clearly referring to, was a weighted average of 5 twin studies from Bouchard 2009, which included 2 US studies, 1 English study, 1 from Denmark, and 1 from Sweden. If you pick out just the US studies, they give heritability figures of 0.71 and 0.73. One study mentioned in the paper but not plotted in the chart is the Minnesota twin study, which used MZA twins and produced a broad heritability of 0.7. Now, to be charitable, in your second video you seem to realize this chart contains data other than Dutch data, but from your comment here it seems you were under the impression that this entire chart is from the 8 Dutch twin studies. So the bottom line is this chart does have some data from the United States, including the specific value alt-hype was citing, but more importantly, there isn't any serious dispute that heritability of IQ is basically the same among people in the Western world. If there was any significant difference found between heritability in the Netherlands or any other Western European country, or white people in the United States, then you might have a point, but there really isn't.
Which doesn't seem very controversial until you remember he says...
So first we can look at the high heritability of IQ within the United States, which is about 75% in adulthood based on 2 different kinds of twin studies and family relations studies.
It's not only looking at the heritability of intelligence, but also the shared environment influence on intelligence. It's not the IQ, it's the G factor. The statistic you pointed out was not done in the United States, but the Netherlands. The statistic you pointed out was also only based on 1 type of twin study. There was no family relations studies, but adoption studies.
Almost every criticism of this sentence is wrong, so let's go through these one by one.
It's not only looking at the heritability of intelligence, but also the shared environment influence on intelligence.
High heritability of IQ necessitates having a low shared environment component. They're not independent variables.
It's not the IQ, it's the G factor.
Before I get into the G thing, first a bit of background. Yes, the paper does have a figure label that says, estimate of genetic and shared environmental influence of G by age. This causes a lot of back and forth on YouTube and Twitter comments. Drallasta mocks alt-hype that he, quote, can't even read a graph, and alt-hype argues that despite the graph label, that the paper is about IQ, not G, and that anyone with an operational understanding of the research would know this. Also, somebody on Twitter actually writes Bouchard asking him what this is about, and he says, oops, yeah, that should be IQ. So with that out of the way, I'm going to explain what G is and why, despite Bouchard's correction, this is actually a completely appropriate label for the graph. The G factor is just the name given to the factor that explains the largest portion of variance in IQ when the test results are subjected to factor analysis. In plain terms, G is a measure of how well the results of the subtests of an IQ test correlate with each other. So in this sense, G is not a score that can be assigned to somebody. You can say somebody has an IQ of 100, but it wouldn't be valid to say you have a G of 100. G is not something that can be measured on a ratio scale. However, despite the abstract nature of G as calculated in factor analysis, the evidence is overwhelming that whatever causes all these diverse IQ tests to correlate so well with each other must be getting at some real property in the brain. So in intelligence research, G has a second definition, which is basically a substitute for the term intelligence. This is done in part to bypass the philosophical question of, what is intelligence anyway? We're saying it's G, now let's move on. According to Plomin, IQ tests, quote, yield total scores that are reasonable indices of G, unquote. So in many research papers and in Plomin's book on behavioral genetics, the figures often reference G as a substitute for intelligence. But don't take my word for it, let's see what Plomin has to say about this.
But what happened in the early 1900s is people developed measures of intelligence. And even now, that's contentious for some people, but I think it's very well measured. And it began with Charles Spearman in England in 1904, where he said, intelligence just means too many different things to different people. I mean, what do you mean by intelligence, really? So he said, I'm going to define it precisely. G, general cognitive ability. And what that is what diverse tests of cognitive ability have in common. So you've got hundreds of tests of cognitive abilities, like different types of memory, different types of verbal, vocabulary fluency, spatial ability. There's many different types of cognitive tests, but they all correlate substantially, which is quite surprising to people. You know, if you're good in verbal, it means on average, you're probably pretty good in memory, pretty good in spatial. People say, oh no, I'm good at spatial, I'm not good at verbal, or vice versa. But they are pretty good. They just mean they're better at this than that. They correlate substantially so that 40% of the variance, the individual differences of all those tests, are in common. And that's what we mean by G.
Also, everything I've said here is in agreement with the Wikipedia page on the G factor. Quote, composite scores, or IQ scores, based on many tests are frequently regarded as estimates of individuals standing on the G factor. The terms IQ, general intelligence, general cognitive ability, general mental ability, or simply intelligence are often used interchangeably to refer to this common core shared by cognitive tests, unquote. I'm not saying Wikipedia is an authoritative source, but if you find yourself arguing with a Wikipedia article on something, it should at least give you pause. In a sense, everybody involved was wrong on this topic. Drallasta was wrong for even bringing it up in the first place. Alt-hype was wrong for arguing that there's a meaningful distinction between IQ and G when used in this context, and Bouchard was wrong for apologizing for using it in the figure label. I would guess Bouchard just figured that since the graph is using correlations of full-scale IQ scores for the heritability estimates, it would be easier to just say, yes, we're talking about IQ here, rather than go into a long discussion of how full-scale IQ is a good proxy for G, and so on.
Statistic you pointed out was not done in the United States, but the Netherlands.
No, the cited .75 includes data from the United States, England, Denmark, and Sweden.
The statistic you pointed out was also only based on one type of twin study.
For the two types of twin studies, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. You seem to be zeroing in on the Dutch data, which you assumed is what alt-hype was referring to, even though at this point he's arguing the data says 75% here, which doesn't fall along the Dutch data line at all. Anyway, the Dutch was just MZT twins. If anything, he was referencing the .74 MZA twins, again assuming he was referencing anything specifically from this chart at all. But for the benefit of the audience, there actually are two types of twin studies used in that graph. MZA, twins reared apart, where the twins' correlated IQ scores are used to estimate heritability directly, and MZT versus DCT twin studies, where the identical twins reared together are contrasted with fraternal twins reared together to estimate heritability.
There was no family relation studies, but adoption studies.
I'll give you the family relation studies. Good job.
Now, I have found that twin studies don't control for the reliability of IQ tests, and when you do this, the heritability is closer to 80%.
You realize that if you control for the fact that IQ studies aren't actually very good, you're just going to increase the variance, not the heritability.
I have no clue what you're trying to say in that last sentence, so what alt-hype is talking about here is something I've read from Arthur Jensen but was originally proposed by Charles Spearman. If the IQ tests don't measure IQ perfectly, some of the variance will be measurement error. If you can empirically figure out what the test-retest correlation is, then you can correct for an estimate of heritability of IQ. Spearman called this correction for attenuation. It turns out that modern IQ tests have very good test-retest reliability. It's somewhere around 0.9 to 0.95, so when this is applied, the heritability estimate will be a little bit higher.
Adopting families tend to be mid to high socioeconomic status, so you don't get the full range of environments that exist in the broader society that we're talking about whenever the twin study is being done. In 2007, McGee et al. Looked at 409 adoptive siblings compared to a control of 208 non-adoptive siblings, and looked at just how much their environments actually differed.
I don't think alt-hype realizes that there is little controversy saying that intelligence is heritable. Just to run you through a thought experiment, if I managed to remove all your DNA from your cells, would you get smarter or dumber? Well, you'd probably die in a few minutes to a couple of hours of something akin to radiation sickness without the burns.
I'm not sure what the relevance is of your thought experiment here. He's looking at the evidence that actually tries to quantify the restriction of range effects on twin studies that might lead to overestimating heritability.
And the first thing to note is that the environments were not as restricted as you might think.
Well, just to rain on your parade, in all of the categories on this table, the adoptive parent is white over 90% of the time. And the majority of the adoptive children were Asian. I could rattle through a few more, but I'll just let him get on with his point.
For an index of family functioning and parent depression rates, there is almost no difference in the ranges you get from adoptive and non-adoptive families.
I thought at first when going through this video that I'd just ignore this point. It doesn't prove anything, but I stopped myself taking the easy way out and read the table he cites, and how glad am I that I did that, because it shows alt-hype can't even read a simple table.
For socioeconomic status, while you get 82% of the variance you get in the general population, the adoptive families were 0.53 standard deviations higher in socioeconomic status and 0.33 standard deviations less likely to have disinhibitory behavior.
You got the figures for the family functionality and the parental depression the wrong way round.
Okay, so we got the family functioning and parent depression flipped around. Obviously he's incapable of analyzing data then. Is anyone else seeing why I got so annoyed watching this video? The whole point of this table is to look at restriction of range effects and the corresponding difference in twin environments versus the general population. Family functioning and parent depression were 99% and 103%, so basically identical in range to the general population. The fact that he accidentally flipped these has zero impact on his argument.
He weirdly puts variance as a percentage for some reason, and this data set is not very similar to the general populace, and you'd have known that if you'd read the data.
Again with the variance, why is citing it as a percentage weird? He's looking at restriction of range. The idea is that the variance and environment of the twin studies will be smaller than the environmental variance of the general population, and that the difference between the range-restricted population and the general population can be expressed as a percentage. The whole point of all this is that the range-restricted population could lead to an inflated estimate of heritability that wouldn't be accurate for the entire population, so he's presenting data that shows the range restriction to be rather insignificant.
At least when controlling for socioeconomic status, which social scientists like to do a lot because it's one of the easiest things to control for, we see that both in delinquent behavior and in IQ, the adoptive siblings don't differ at all based on parental socioeconomic status.
I think you just broke my brain. One of these graphs isn't even looking at social economic status, it's looking at delinquency rates against parents' antisocial behavior, alcohol dependency, and drug dependency.
Okay, so this is another instance of alt-hype being sloppy, but this mistake changes nothing to the argument at hand. It looks like he lifted those graphs straight from the paper. The graph on the right is immaterial because what we're talking about here is IQ and whether range restriction is really a problem or not. And apparently not, because the range of environments we do see in twin studies seems to have little to no effect on the IQ of the adopted children.
Now don't misunderstand what this is saying. This does not mean that parental environment doesn't matter. It simply means that poorer parents aren't producing any worse environments than richer parents, at least not to a degree that noticeably impacts either IQ or delinquency.
You left out the part where that's only for adoptive children, because if you look at the other side of the graph, hey, look! As the parent's socioeconomic status goes up, the average IQ of the children goes up. The only thing I can draw from this is that adoptive children are not as impacted by their parental environment as biological children are.
The only thing you can draw from this is that the adopted children are not impacted by the SES of the adoptive parents. Are you sure that's the only way to read this data? How about the well-established correlation between IQ and socioeconomic status? According to the American Psychological Association, this correlation is 0.33, and since the adopted children's IQ is not apparently affected by their adoptive parents' SES, what conclusion would you draw here? IQ almost certainly has a causal effect on SES, and intelligence is heritable, and if you'd read the bell curve, this would have been immediately obvious. Less intelligent people tend to be poorer, less educated, and a whole host of other things that are factored into an SES score. To some extent, their SES is a product of their low intelligence. The reverse is true of highly intelligent people, and since intelligence is heritable, this IQ is in part passed on to their children. However, since intelligence late in life is mostly a product of your genetics, the IQ of adopted children will be very weakly correlated with the IQ of their adoptive parents.
And the consensus on these is that by age 24, the heritability of IQ in the United States is around 75%, according to Wikipedia.
Watch out, here comes the Wikipedia citations. Wait. Strange. Looks like it's been updated with more recent information since you last looked. I wonder who could have done that.
I have to admit, I've been holding back on you, waiting for the Wikipedia jab. I actually remember reading that original Wikipedia entry before it changed. The cited 0.75 heritability figure was referencing a paper from the American Psychological Association. After the bell curve came out, experts in the field noticed that the media conversation about the book was basically fucking retarded. So they decided to create a task force to present the state of knowledge in the field to, in a sense, fact-check the bell curve. The paper was called Intelligence, Knowns, and Unknowns. And there it is. Their estimate of IQ heritability by adulthood is 0.75. So if you're going to argue against 0.75 heritability by adulthood, you're also arguing with the American Psychological Association.
And according to Robert Plomin, it's about 80%, which is the number I think it is.
Did you just take Robert Plomin's name in vain again? This graph is from the paper by Bouchard, not Plomin. You thought misquoting him would be enough, but now you have to misread a graph that's not even by him. Plomin thinks it's somewhere between 20 and 50%, dear. I know this wasn't out when the video was made, but it's nice to set the record straight for Plomin's sake.
Yes, he misattributes the graph, but by all means, let's set the record straight on Plomin.
But instead of assuming it's all environmental, we got to ask, is it genetic? And behavioral genetics over a century has shown that individual differences in intelligence are heritable. If you take the world's literature of several hundred studies, twin, adoption, family studies, you come up with an estimate of about 50%. But what's really interesting underneath that is if you ask about development, it turns out there's a linear increase in the heritability of intelligence from infancy to childhood to adolescence to adulthood. Infancy, 20%. Childhood, adolescence, 40%. Adulthood, 60%. Later in life, 80%.
So, while I'm finally having fun here, let's take a look at another article that was published in order to set the record straight on the science presented in the bell curve. In 1994, the Wall Street Journal published an editorial written by Linda Gottfriedson titled Mainstream Science on Intelligence. When I first found this, her name immediately rang a bell. I think the first time I saw her was on a Science Channel show called Through the Wormhole with Morgan Freeman. They actually did an episode on race and intelligence, if you can believe it. Fun fact, if you Google her name, the fourth hit is an article from the SPLC. This editorial, among other things, states the heritability of IQ to be between 0.4 and 0.8, which was also the range cited in the bell curve. So 80% heritability is on the high end of the, quote, mainstream, according to this article. It also states regarding race and ethnic gaps in mean IQ that, quote, most experts believe the environment is important, but that genetics could be involved too. Basically, this editorial restates the basic conclusion of the state of the science presented in the bell curve, so you know, racist pseudoscience. So, let's take a look at what evil racists signed this thing. Okay, Bouchard, yeah, of course. Feldman, Fleischman, Gordon. Linda Gottfriedson, she wrote this, that makes sense. Richard Hare, editor of Intelligence. I know that guy. Who else on here? Arthur Jensen, holy shit, here comes the racists. Thorndike, know that name. Sandra Scarr, know that one. Philippe Rushton, holy shit again. Richard Lynn, oh wait, go back, what was that one? Ooh, that's awkward.
So, with all that background out of the way, I can finally make the first and weakest argument, which is that because the general heritability of IQ within the United States is 80%, our starting assumption for the racial gaps should be 80%.
Alright, this is getting too long for my liking. Subscribe for part 2 coming in a few days' time, and if you're responding to this, remember, if you strike me down, I will become more powerful than you could possibly imagine.
Alright, so let's move on to your second video.
So, did I have a good time after the last video? Now, you might think that going through tweets is completely pointless, but just indulge me for a minute. Naomi shared a clip from my video on Twitter and whew, all hype came back. Literally every claim made in this snippet was wrong. The estimates came from multiple countries and states in the US, and it was explicitly about IQ and not G. It looked at studies using multiple methods, MZ, DZ, family relations. Just an amazing string of wrong.
For the most part, he's correct here. Reading it in your imagined petulant voice doesn't make it incorrect.
Where do I start? We'll get back to the IQ not G thing because that's just, ooh, amazing. But later. So, Alt Hype says that IQ is 80% heritable. Well, ignoring that heritability isn't measured in percentage again.
You might want to take up that heritability percentage thing with Robert Plomin, but I think I just discovered another thing you're mistaken about. Do you really think there's a mathematical distinction between saying something is 0.7 heritable and 70% heritable, or likewise with variance? That's the only way I can make sense of your statements on this.
You would think that he'd use one of the data points that would prove his position, like this one or this one, which are Dutch data points, but instead he decides to use a point down here instead, which at the end says MZA twins, which if you'd like to go back to the key, says Swedish data.
Wrong. I guess you can't read a graph either. As I've already discussed, the MZA with a dotted line is from Bouchard 2009, which is an average of 5 studies, 2 of which are United States studies, with results of 0.71 and 0.73. Also, the 0.73 had the largest sample size of the 5 studies. The Swedish data is actually right here. Turns out that heritability of IQ is quite high by age 65, in Sweden anyway.
So I got which data point he was pointing to wrong.
And you get the explanation of what you got wrong.
But he's still got everything wrong anyway. Oh, and he left a pretty comment too. You just watched the clip on Twitter, and you feel like this gives you a decent viewpoint of what my video was about? Hey, look, you said it's the Bouchard paper. Have a smiley face for not misattributing to Plomin again. And well done. It does use several countries. The issue is...
So first we can look at the high heritability of IQ within the United States, which is about 75%.
You were the one to say it was United States data.
Yes, and he's right, and that 0.74 includes United States data.
Whoops. So then he goes on to quote the paper by Bouchard, and said there are loads of studies, and this is just true. To go through really quickly... No. This is quite up for debate, and saying that it isn't really proves your lack of scientific curiosity. Plomin thinks it's 50%.
Nope, Plomin thinks it's 60% by late adolescence or adulthood, and as high as 80% later in life.
This paper says 30 to 50%.
I'm really glad you referenced that paper the way you did. Are we talking about IQ or G here? This paragraph is talking about G. Drallasta can't even read a paper. Actually, this paper does a good job of justifying what I was saying earlier about G. To quote the paper, as a preparation for the studies of intelligence that are discussed below, it is important to appreciate that they are rarely conducted using a statistically derived G factor. Some are, but others are often conducted using total IQ scores from a battery of tests, like the Wechsler tests, or single tests that load highly on the general cognitive ability factor. The intelligence phenotype, whether it be the G factor score, a total IQ score, or a score from a single highly G-loaded test, has remarkable psychometric credentials. So in other words, when researchers talk about G, most of the time they're using a full-scale IQ test score as a proxy for G.
So to say that something is true facts when 1, there's not a scientific agreement, and 2, it's not static, which heritability isn't, means that you're ignorant or, Besides, you know why I don't need to die on this hill.
It's far too late to say you don't need to die on this hill. You fought on it and you died horrifically.
Because it doesn't help your point. Because that isn't your argument in this video. But we'll get to that. This is also the worst graph that I have ever seen, and this would never have been published in a better journal. It's not as if Bouchard isn't famous within psychology. With 16,000 citations, he's pretty well renowned. So why would a renowned scientist publish in a shitty journal? Well, probably so they can get away with shitty mistakes like this one. Any experienced psychologist would know that this is a huge blunder.
It's not a huge blunder, as I have already described in great detail.
Now, the issue is, if Alt-Hype had read the graph, he would have clearly seen it was said G and not IQ. So not only did Alt-Hype read the graph was wrong too. And now he's trying to say that not reading the graph properly is him getting it right. My point was quite clear in the video. If you had bothered to watch it at all, you can't even read a graph.
In case it wasn't obvious, I'm just letting her hang herself on her own words here, rather than respond to any of this directly, now that all of you know better.
So you pointing out that you read the graph wrong, and that your citation was so bad that an author mislabeled an axis of a figure and it wasn't noticed, really doesn't solidify your position as a trustworthy source of information, does it? And I spoke earlier of a hills not to die on, and here's one that Alt-Hype decided to die on. Nominal IQ. So I spoke to two different psychologists and they had no idea what he meant.
First, I'd like to say this tweet is absolutely correct. Also, whether nominal IQ is the correct way to describe this, I'd say full-scale IQ score is probably a better term, but it's absolutely clear what he's saying here if you have any idea what the G-factor is or know anything about IQ test construction. Some interesting insights can be found by looking at subtest G-loading or subtest heritability and how it varies between groups. Full-scale IQ or raw IQ or nominal IQ won't give you this information.
So I chucked it into Google Scholar in quotation marks and had a look. It's a PDF on the American Conservative. It uses nominal IQ. Turns out, Alt-Hype thinks you can take the concept of nominal GDP, just take the word nominal and apply it to IQ, which is cute. Maybe I should just take the concept of philosophical realism and apply it to race realism because they both contain the word realism.
If there were a place to use the term nominal IQ, it would be here in regards to the Flynn effect. It's actually an almost perfect analogy for nominal GDP versus real GDP. Whereas nominal GDP doesn't account for inflation to give a constant dollar comparison, the Flynn effect is a kind of IQ inflation that has been observed to be about 3 IQ points per decade. So when citing IQ scores from decades ago, you need to correct for the Flynn effect to provide a useful comparison to modern data.
So, with all that background out of the way, I can finally make the first and weakest argument, which is that because the general heritability of IQ within the United States is 80%, our starting assumption for the racial gaps should be 80%.
Okay, so you're clearly having an issue with the understanding of basic maths and basic trends. I'm just going to ignore all of my earlier points against your logic and just run with 80%. So take for instance the green population. The green population has an average heritability of IQ of 80%. And there's a blue population as well, which also has an average heritability of IQ of 80%. These two groups in the purple population altogether have an average heritability of 80% too. All of these groups can interbreed with no issues at all. So with this framework, I'll attempt to explain how saying the racial graph of 80% can be taken in multiple ways. Mainly because it makes no sense at all. If I take him at his exact word, saying a racial gap is 80%, that would mean that the green population has an average IQ of 100, then the blue population would have an average IQ of 180, or vice versa, or the green population would have an average IQ of 100, and the blue population would have an average IQ of 20, or vice versa.
It's honestly an insult to your viewers to even bring this up as a reasonable interpretation of what he's saying.
Another way to take this is that the heritability gap is 80%, which makes no sense at all. Heritability is only concerned with one group at a time. It can be used to explain gaps, but I'll give him a pass for not being a scientist. If the gap is 80% heritable itself, then only 80% of the gap would be passed down to the next generation if it's if we start removing the environment, making the gap 20% smaller every generation.
This can only make sense if you autistically take the gap is 80% heritable as literally as possible. Even then, I'm not sure that it makes sense. What he's saying is the IQ gap is 80% due to differences in genes between the populations, and 20% is due to differences in environment between the populations. I know this, you know this, everyone who watched your video that isn't retarded knows this. He goes into 2 further reasons to think this may be the case, but you don't even bother to mention that. So in summary, on the main scientific points, alt-hype is completely correct. Sloppy, but correct. Your attempt to discredit him as an unreliable source of information only revealed your own lack of understanding on these topics. It's really quite amazing because most of this stuff is in a basic undergrad or maybe even high school textbook. Read the 1 chapter from Plomin's behavioral genetics book about general cognitive ability. That alone would have saved you from most of the stuff you got wrong in this video. You would have known that heritability estimates for IQ are quite high by adulthood. Plomin uses 60% for early adulthood. He acknowledges that MZA twins give a direct broad heritability estimate that is at least 0.7 by adulthood. You would have known that G, IQ, and intelligence are frequently used interchangeably in the literature. Basically, you would have known that Plomin wouldn't have much disagreement with what alt-hype is saying up until the 80% genetic race differences stuff. So anyway, I'm certainly no expert, but I've read quite a lot on this topic over the past year. Everything I've read so far puts guys like alt-hype and Sean Last closer to the truth than their critics. Not that I expect you to take any of my advice, but if you're going to fight them online, either gain an actual understanding of this research, or fight them on the political positions that they draw from this research.